Hello, and thank you for joining us on World Press Freedom Day. Welcome from me, Mike Scott, in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sandy Ungar in Washington, DC, to this, the 32nd jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button and not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them into some kind of logical order for us to consider later on. Please, we urge you to ask your questions as and when they come to you, rather than leaving them late on, because we don't want a bottleneck at the end. Okay, I'm looking forward to today's freedom of press discussion. And with that, over to you, Sandy.
Thanks very much, Mike. Glad to be here with, as you say, a distinguished panel. I'll introduce them briefly. Michael Abramowitz is president of Freedom House, and which has played a leading role in monitoring free speech and other basic human rights in countries both developing and developed around the world for many years. Mike himself spent 24 years at the Washington Post previously, and then worked at the Holocaust Museum in some very significant projects before taking over Freedom House just a few years ago. Sharon Moshavi, I'm doing this in alphabetical order, is president of the International Center for Journalists. She's spent 15 years as a journalist in the Middle East, among other places, for Newsday, and in writing about North Korea, India, and other international spots where freedom issues are very much at stake. Glad she could be with us too. Gabe Rotman is director of technology and press freedom at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, an organization started back in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, to counter incursions on press freedom during the Nixon administration initially, and has been operating ever since. And from London, Jane Singer, who is professor of journalism innovation at the City University of London. She has a particular interest in the impact of digital media on the roles, norms, practices, and products of journalism organizations. This is a holiday. It's a nice sort of holiday to try to celebrate World Press Freedom Day. But as we were preparing for this, and as we thought about it, we wondered, is there more to celebrate than there is to lament on this particular occasion? A report from the World Association of News Publishers recently showed dramatic increases in developed countries in government threats to media, legal intimidation and retaliation, denial of access to information, online harassment, and cyber attacks, substantial increases during the past year or so. So I wonder, should we be celebrating or warning that maybe we need 2 or 3 World Press Freedom Days a year to try to call people's attention to this? Mike, your organization monitors freedoms across the board. What are you celebrating today?
Well, I thank you, Sandy, for having me, and thank you for the question. I think we need to be both celebrating and warning. I mean, the reality is that there is a lot of great journalism that is going on around the world, in the United States and elsewhere. Reporters holding, exposing government malfeasance, doing really fine work And so I think that is always to be celebrated. And I'm always impressed by my former colleagues in journalism who are doing this kind of great work. I think the thing you also have to say, Sandy, is that it's a lot harder than it ought to be in the current environment. I was a reporter for almost 25 years, as you suggest, as you pointed out, and I can't think of a time in my lifetime when the press was really under greater threat globally than it is today. And I think the important point to say is that these threats are multiple, right? There's physical attacks, there's traditional censorship, there's efforts by the state, by certain states, to economically intimidate the media. There's digital harassment now. Women reporters in particular, but many reporters face online, Twitter mobs if they do good reporting. So I think the multiplicity of threats is of deep concern to me, and that's the point that I would start with today.
Sharon, from the perspective of the International Center for Journalists, what is your mood at this point?
I share Mike's very much. There is a lot of amazing journalism being done. I am constantly amazed at colleagues around the world who are working in very difficult circumstances for not a lot of money, and they get up in the morning and they do this all the time. But as Mike said, the threats have multiplied. I mean, it is not, it is the digital age has given us all kinds of new threats to press freedom. And Mike listed, sadly, a very long list, but I want to add another couple, unfortunately. One is disinformation. Disinformation campaigns are a calculated way that governments and authoritarians and others are doing to undermine the credibility of journalists. We've done research on online harassment against women journalists, for example, and we've seen in everybody from Maria Ressa on down, active attempts. That's the biggest form of harassment also, or almost, is to undermine the credibility of what you're doing. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of it in our network is a trend I don't love seeing, which is the rise of exile media. We've seen everything from El Faro and El Salvador just moved their administrative offices to Costa Rica, and Mike can talk about how Costa Rica isn't even Costa Rica anymore. We've seen, Hong Kong. We're supporting a Hong Kong journalist who are now working from overseas. Obviously, Russian journalists, independent Russian media has had to flee. So that is another trend that we're seeing that is really very troubling.
Gabe, I want to come back to you in just a moment about digital threats, but I want to ask Jane first what your students are saying, what you're telling them about careers in journalism, about things to do. I attended a celebration last night of the 10th anniversary of the journalism program at Georgetown University. It was a sort of a latecomer to having a journalism education program. And young man from CNN who was a graduate of Georgetown and has had a great career was telling a grim story, despite the excitement and the thrill he gets from doing it, but about all of the dangers today to being, especially being an international correspondent. What are you seeing among your students?
Well, first I would say that Mike and Sharon make really good points, and it's both a celebration of all the amazing work that's done, but also concern about growing threats. And I would just add one more to the list of concerns, which is threats of surveillance. I was just at virtually attending a session earlier from the Washington Post and Reporters Without Borders, who, of course, as you know, released their index today, and they were talking about increasing sophistication of governments in using technology to spy on journalists, to find new ways to curtail journalist movements and journalist activity. So I think that's another one to add to the things we need to be concerned about. Students, I think like students always go into this with a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. There's a lot of concern about online harms in particular that you've already highlighted. Mike and Sharon have already talked about. We try to prepare them for that. We try to talk to them about how to take care of yourself, how to, respond to traumatic situations that you have to cover. So we do try to talk to them about that. But I think journalists, students are enthusiastic. We talk to them about being open to change. It's a constantly changing world, and that they need to be able to develop the resilience to deal with that. And we talk to them also about economic threats to the media, which is something maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. But obviously there are financial concerns as well.
Gabe, when the internet came to be a tool for journalists, it's in such a dramatic way, everyone thought it was going to increase press freedom, and it was going to make work so much easier, facilitate things. Jim Brady, from now at the Knight Foundation, which funds my free speech project, is a pioneer in this area. But now we're hearing more and more about the sort of dangers and the drawbacks of digital journalism. That's what you work on for the Reporters Committee. How is that going?
It's a great question, Sandy, and thanks for it. I'm going to put everybody to sleep and talk about the law for a second. But I think what has happened with the advent of the internet, and particularly the fact that we all carry pretty powerful computers in our pockets every day, there's almost, I think, been a bit of an overcorrection on the legal side, and that's what we have focused a lot of effort on. And it is manifested in efforts to roll back legal protections that have been in place for the press in the name of combating disinformation or concerns about concentration among large social media platforms. And those, the two that are kind of in the crosshairs are the New York Times v. Sullivan case, which required a public figure suing somebody for defamation to prove that that person really thought that what they were saying was false. And then there's also kind of an under the radar challenge to a case from the 70s called Miami Herald v. Tornillo, which established that that editorial discretion by private actors, particularly the press, is inviolable by the government. That case involved a Florida law that mandated that if a newspaper editorialized against someone, that person had a right to publish a response in the paper. The Supreme Court said in that case that that's a no-go under the First Amendment. But both of those, in Sullivan, you may have seen efforts in Florida to pass legislation that would tee up a challenge to Sullivan. And then also Florida and Texas, as well as Washington State and New York, have passed laws that would impinge on the editorial choices of the large social media platforms. The Texas and Florida laws have currently been enjoined, and we expect that the Supreme Court is likely to take up that case in the coming term. And in that case, we'll tee up a direct challenge to the Tornillo decision. But I think that there also is, there's room for optimism on that front as well. Particularly with Sullivan, you haven't seen a groundswell of support for revisiting that precedent. And on the Tornillo side, the courts, the Fifth Circuit, with respect to the Texas law, issued an opinion that had many folks kind of scratching their head. But the 11th Circuit with the Florida law, that opinion was pretty straightforward and applied Tornillo faithfully. So again, those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. Again, super boring. Hopefully, people wake up after that. But that's the stuff that keeps me up.
I can well imagine that. I don't think there's any worry about people being bored today as we think about this. I'd like to explore some of the recent cases, some that have gotten a lot of attention, and there are others that simply haven't. I mean, first, I just want to note from that same World Association of News Publishers report, at least 66 journalists killed around the world in 2022. That's nothing compared to the death toll from AIDS. It's nothing compared to the death toll from random shootings in the United States. Still 66 people. who thought they were doing an important job. 363 journalists currently in prison around the world. That's a big number too, if we're going to focus on that. So are there some recent dramatic cases that we may not know about? We know about Evan Gershkovich in Moscow. We, especially at Georgetown, know about Austin Tice in Syria, who was a Georgetown law student at the time he was taken in Syria more than a decade ago and not heard from since, but there seems to be evidence that he's still alive. Are there some other cases that we don't know about? Sharon, I think you know of some that.
One thing I want to call attention to is Mexico. Mexico has become the deadliest country for journalists. Latin America as a whole there is no active war zone in Latin America, and yet it is the most deadliest region in the world, which to me is in a lot of ways more frightening than journalists killed in the fog of war, if you will. I think what the efforts are, and as you say, the numbers, right? If you look at the numbers compared to the world's ills, they're small, but they're designed to be chilling. They're designed to scare journalists away from doing the stories. And to me, that is the part that is really scary. But at the same time, what you're starting to see more from journalists, which I think is an attempt to counter this, is to collaborate, is to, you can kill the journalist, but you can't kill the story. That there's an organization called Forbidden Stories, which is working on that. There's a fantastic Czech reporter named Pavla Hocheva, who we gave an award to a couple of years ago. Her Slovak colleague, Jan Kociak, and his fiance were killed, point blank killed. They were investigating corrupt businessmen in Slovakia with ties to the government. It ended up going all the way to the police. And she and a number of colleagues, I think there was 11 newsrooms, were involved, and they reported the story. They finished the job, and it led to bringing down the government, and it had a lot of impact in the short term. I don't think it's solved Slovakia's full corruption problems, but that to me was such an important message to send. So, seeing more cases like that, seeing journalists work together, we're doing that a lot. We're seeing that a lot in Latin America, investigative reporting networks, and finding ways to report the story, even when there are threats to individual journalists. So this to me is a way to fight back. Oops, my lights just went out. This is the way to, I didn't move enough. This is a way to help, I think, act as a deterrent to the killing of journalists.
Mike, does Freedom House see any hope on the horizon in this area?
Well, I'm always a hopeful guy, Sandy, to be honest, and I take generally hope from the fact that you see a very strong demand that continues for freedom. I mean, I think just the level of protests around the world over the last 5 years is, to me, astonishing. Even in Hong Kong, you had 3 or 4 million people who flooded the streets of Hong Kong in protest of the national security law. I mean, to me, that says there's still a demand for freedom and basic human rights, even if authoritarian regimes are cracking down. I do think, if I may just add 2 quick things, Sandy, on the issue. I mean, there are really dozens of cases that, we're particularly thinking about. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is a Russian, he's actually a Washington Post opinion writer, as well as being a Russian dissident. He's facing really an outrageous sentence of 25 years. The arrest of Evan and of Vladimir and others really shows to me Putin's complete disdain for any kind of norms of press freedom. Even during the Soviet period, I think American journalists, could do their work without fear of being arrested. I guess it happened occasionally, but this was really an outrageous case. And there are lesser known cases as well. One person that we've been tracking at Freedom House is the case of Nguyen Van Hoa, who's a journalist for Radio Free Asia, who's done really amazing work on environmental issues in Vietnam, and has been and has now been in prison for some time. I mean, they're really just, hundreds of cases of these little known people. And I think one issue too that I hope we can get to is it's, as Sharon talked about, the chilling effect. I mean, it's just, even for those who aren't in jail, there's really a strong chilling effect that we're deeply concerned about. So, I mean, to be a journalist today is really among the most dangerous, I think, professions in certain countries that there is.
Gabe, it might not be a popular thing to do, but I have to bring up the question of what's happening in the United States, not be too smug about all this. Are there some very serious threats to journalistic freedom in the United States right now?
I think there always are. I think things have gotten a bit better in terms of one of the major threats, which I think is surveillance, as Jane mentioned earlier, particularly governmental surveillance. In 2021, we found out that during the last year of the previous administration, the Justice Department had authorized subpoenas and court orders had secretly authorized subpoenas and court orders for the phone records and email records of 8 reporters across 3 outlets, CNN, Washington Post, and the New York Times, all in national security leak cases. And the records that they sought went all the way back to 2017, which led a number of us to question how the Justice Department had interpreted their policy that permits them to delay notifying affected members of the news media of such process. That was a significant controversy in the press freedom community, and it led the Justice Department to engage members of the news media in reformulating that policy, the news media guidelines. Again, this is something that's kind of under the radar, but it's a really big deal because there isn't a federal shield law that protects reporters from having to disclose the identity of confidential sources in legal proceedings. So on the federal level, which is where you're going to see a lot of national security reporting or reporting on federal law enforcement, those guidelines are particularly important. The Justice Department, in revising them, abandoned what had previously been kind of a balancing test where you weigh the investigative interest of the department with press freedom equities as the department saw it, and the Justice Department did away with that balancing test and now implemented effectively a bright line which says that you can't get process, you can't get subpoenas, court orders, search warrants if the reporter is acting within the scope of news gathering, and then it defines news gathering pretty broadly. There is a potential loophole in the guidelines that could permit an aggressive prosecutor to argue that a reporter who's engaged in routine news gathering is somehow complicit in an underlying crime, like the leak of classified information or a potential hack. But it does create this zone of protection that is broader than before, and is kind of a big deal. So I would say that also is a reason for cautious optimism. But again, it's something we're also keeping a pretty close eye on. So I think, we'll see what happens going forward. But in terms of, general threats to the press in the United States, we haven't been working 14, 16-hour days quite as much, if that makes sense. And there's one other thing that I can talk about in a bit, which is also police encounters with journalists at protests, which has also been a focus of our efforts at Reporters Committee.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a moment. That's a good point. Mike, did you have something you wanted to add here?
I did. I just wanted to pick up on Gabe's point about the U.S. and just to kind of put it in a broader context. One thing I'm very, very concerned about, and what we see at Freedom House is, other countries are looking very closely at what's happening in the United States, and it's particularly authoritarian regimes. I was struck, one of the first years I was at Freedom House, and President Trump started using the word,
enemies of the people,
and enemies of the people. And honestly, you saw a lot of countries, picking up on that and adopting laws that basically were anti-press laws in the name of combating fake news. So people, authoritarian regimes are really watching the United States closely. That's why it's so important that America, in particular, have really strong standards for press freedom, and it's why I frankly get concerned with some proposals of regulation of certain things. I mean, I think regulation is something you can discuss, but believe me, if the United States does something, Russia or China are going to be looking for ways to pick up on that as an excuse for what they're going to do. So it's really important for the United States to exemplify and model good press behavior, good behavior towards the press.
Jane, there's been some concern recently, I think, under the Conservative government in the UK about the independence of the BBC and some attacks on the BBC. Does this rise to the level that we should also not forget to talk about that today? And by the way, before you answer me, I want to just remind our audience around the world that this would be a good time to put your questions, any questions you have, into the Q&A slot on the bottom of your screen, so we don't get too crunched up at the end. What about the BBC and other media institutions presumed to be safe?
Yeah, let me just real quickly pick up on the points from just real quickly about that Gabe and Mike have been highlighting, which is to say that governments around the world, I think, look around and see other governments getting away with bad treatment of the press, ranging from being called enemies of the people to literally putting people in jail or even having them executed, and they see them getting away with it, right? I mean, it gets maybe called out, but maybe not, and so I think there's a real concern about not only the level of threat, but the perception among people who would do harm to journalists that they can do that. And so I think that is a real concern. Now, I also would just pick up on Vietnam. Vietnam is now third from the bottom in terms of in the latest index of press freedom. It's sunk a few places. It's ahead of only North Korea and China. So one of the countries with the most journalists in jail anywhere. They've essentially shut down an independent press in Vietnam. So one to keep an eye on. BBC, kind of a different situation. I also say about the US. The US is, I think, in the latest ranking, something like 45th. It's not at the top by any means. It's not even in the top cluster. So there are concerns around the world, I think, about press freedom in the US. And while everyone looks to the US and the First Amendment is a model in many ways, I think there's a perception that in practice the US is not living up to its mandate to protect its own press. BBC is an interesting one. Some of the BBC issues that it faces are political. Many are financial. As you know, the BBC is funded by a license fee paid by anyone who has a TV. And when I moved to the UK, it was literally, I think the first letter I got was from the licensing commission saying, pay your license fee. So we pay that. There's controversy around that. There's been a recent controversy around the appointment of the executive by the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. The fellow was appointed pretty much immediately after he helped Boris Johnson secure an £800,000 loan. So that fellow has now left recently, just within the past few days. So the BBC does face some pressures. It is still the most trusted source of news in the UK, but and I hope we'll talk about trust. I think that's a real issue in the West in particular that we need to talk about when we talk about press freedom. Still the most trusted, but has declined considerably. Fewer than half the people now believe the BBC to be unbiased. So there's a decline in even the most trusted media outlets in the UK. So the BBC is under pressure in a variety of ways. Yes. Kind of a long answer and maybe indirect answer.
No, that's good. Thank you. Let's talk about trust. Sharon, do you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that is the core. It is a core issue. and it needs to be sort of at the center of all of the journalism and journalistic enterprise that we do. It's not just the BBC, it's everywhere. I mean, Edelman's latest trust barometer, media is just at the bottom of the barrel. And that's just only been getting worse and worse. There are a number of efforts. There's trusting news, trust indicators. We're doing a lot of work around this too, is how do you center trust? How do you actually build trust in an environment where disinformation, flows at the speed of sound? And that's what you're up against. So you're up against all of these forces, not just the active efforts by regimes that want to silence journalists, but also, all these malevolent forces, intentional and misinformation, which is unintentional. So it is something that a lot of news organizations are starting to think about in terms of how do you better engage with your community? How do you have transparency around the process? I mean, for so many people, journalism is sausage making. You don't know what goes into it, and it comes out the other end. I remember when I was a working journalist, the question I would get, and I realized I should have paid more attention to it at the time. It would be like someone would read my story and then ask, well, what was it really like? If you're asking me what was it really like, then I've done a lousy job of explaining, the story and how I got it. So I think this is extremely important in every journalistic venture, and it's not an easy road back at all. But journalism is facing an overall lack of trust in institutions. It's not alone. Obviously governments are pretty low too. Business at this point, sad to say, is that they've got the highest levels of trust. So I think how do you sort of build that kind of brand trust, if you will, individual trust? There's all kinds of research about what does create trust. People are more willing to trust an individual. Are there ways that journalism and news organizations can actualize that? But these things are really hard, because that is another, as we've talked about all of the threats from authoritarian governments, that's another tool in the toolkit. In El Salvador is a great example. The government in El Salvador has done an active job trying to discredit El Faro, and they're not going after them with lawsuits and all of these. I mean, there's other things. Their the surveillance is, they were a Pegasus. They used Pegasus to surveil the journalists, but in addition to all of these things, the president is just using social media to attack the credibility of El Faro. And El Faro used to be incredibly highly regarded. Their credibility is tanked. They've acknowledged, because of the efforts of the government. So there are so many forces, but which makes me, again, go back to what I started by saying, which is that it's got to be at the beginning of the conversation, and how journalism is made and produced and distributed and marketed, and all of these things in all of these regimes. So I think trust is incredibly important. And we can talk about the money side too. I do think it's also a piece of the economics. People want in any kind of country, authoritarian or not, still people are willing to pay for what you value. So we can talk a bit about that more, but the economic picture obviously is another huge one to all of this.
Right. I'll come back to the economic picture in a moment. Following on trust, is there some extent, I haven't heard this term recently, compassion fatigue. Is there some extent to which people who are concerned with very basic human rights issues, including hunger, including people not having places to live, not having to worry about whether their children will survive, all these things, is there some extent to which journalists and the media are thought to be looking for sympathy that a lot of people think they don't deserve, or that they're tired of hearing journalism complaints? Mike, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a good question, Sandy. I'm not sure is the honest answer, but I suspect there's something to be said for that. Let me sort of make 3 points on that. One would be that there is we can't ignore the fact that there was a very serious campaign by authoritarian forces, whether dictators themselves, their allies, or kind of authoritarian mind, to discredit the media. I mean, that is a that is I mean, China devotes, billions of dollars or billions of yuan or the currency there to to basically undermine, spread propaganda, to undermine the media. Russia does the same thing. There are forces of the United States that are very active in trying to discredit journalists. And so I think that's, point number one. I would say journalists, I do think, have to also, and I'm going to say this kind of humbly and with respect, I think there's a question for journalists about really hewing to their standards and upholding the highest standards. I just give you like one small example. I'm very sympathetic to journalists. I understand all the traits, things that they're going through, but I think there is a fuzzing up of the distinction between opinion and news that is very damaging to the press and its credibility, and that many people, it used to be like when I was at the Washington Post, there was a news page and there was actually an editorial page that you could look at, and then there was a distinction and there was criticism of both. But I think now there's kind of a blurring of fact and news, and I think we got to get back to the point that a democratic society depends on both, but I think especially on fact-based journalism that is reliable, that is fair, and I think that is sort of being lost, and I think is one reason why we're facing a little bit of a crisis of confidence in institutions. On your issue about special pleading, Sandy, there is special pleading perhaps, but journalism is like crucial to democracy. We just put out the 50th edition of Freedom in the World, which is our kind of flagship report. One of the key themes is that the main driver, or one of the main drivers of democratic decline around the world was attacks on free media, attacks on free expression. There is no question that if you look at the dictators around the world, the people who are authoritarian minded, the first thing they're trying to do is take over the media, attack the media. That is the first trick in the authoritarian playbook. So it's a very serious problem. There may be special pleading from journalists, and the public may be tired of it, but it's important pleading.
Can I just jump in on that? First, I completely agree on the news and opinion thing. That's a major problem, and I do think that has muddied the waters. Social media hasn't helped with that because news product is so disaggregated from where it came from. So even if you have clearly made it clear this is news, this is opinion, it often gets blurry. So but at the same time, I do think it is incumbent to look into our own journalistic houses to try to solve that, because I do agree that is a credibility issue. So that does go to the heart of trust as well. So I do think, journalists, to your thing about pleading, I think in journalism there can be a lot of looking at all of these things that are coming from the outside, and there are many. But I think the news industry and journalists and journalism need to say, okay, what can we do? What do we have the power to actually do something about? And I think Mike's point about news and opinion is a good one. I also want to get quickly to the pleading issue, or journalists, especially in the West, have not generally advocated for themselves. There are organizations like, folks here and others in CPJ and RSF who advocate. I don't think your average person is hearing a lot of journalists, kind of waving the journalistic flag. I think this is a problem of the few. I think we have the opposite issue. I think more journalists need to, and I think increasingly are getting comfortable, but still many are not, with saying, hey, we are this key pillar of democracy. We are the canary in the coal mine. You come after us, and then this is a harbinger of not good things to come. So I would take the opposite, that I think is an important message to get out, and that
maybe do a better job.
I'm sorry, say again.
Do a better job getting that.
A better job advocating for good journalists. And if you're going to do that successfully, to your point, you need to make it clear that you're looking in your own house and looking to solve the issues inside your own house too.
Jane.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think we don't do a very good job explaining what we do. but if we talk about how important we are and what a good job we're doing, we then have to do the good job. People look at what we do and say, yeah, I think most people in the countries where we're speaking to you from at least support a free press, but then they look at what the press does with that freedom and they think, oh, that's not so good. So I think we have to live by our own rules. But the other thing I was going to say, Sandy, to your question about compassion fatigue, another problem that's confronting journalism as an industry, in addition to trust, which, as Sharon, I think, rightly pointed out, is a huge issue, is a growing trend of news avoidance. People are just tuning out. They can't, they watch the news. It's bad. It's depressing. It's about war. It's about the environment collapse. It's about things that they can't really do anything about. And a lot of people are making a not irrational choice to just say, I'm not going to watch the news anymore. I'm not going to listen to it. I'm going to go do something else with my time. I'm going to turn to my nice, comfortable friends on social media. So another growing problem for the press today, particularly in democratic societies, I think, because we're talking about, we can't be smug in democracies and say, well, yeah, we're getting it right, is that people not only are not trusting us, but are just saying, this is just making me feel helpless and depressed, and I'm just not going to deal with it anymore. This is obviously a huge issue for a free press. We can't have a free press if no one is paying attention or has consciously decided not to pay attention for it, in part because they don't trust it, in part because they feel it's biased, in part because they feel opinion to become blurred. Although that's somewhat of a U.S. perspective. I would just say that in other countries, including other democracies, there is more. Here in the UK, we all know where the different newspapers are coming from. But it's not to say it's not an issue, because it is. But I think another issue we need to not be complacent about in the West is that people are just deciding not to use the media at all.
Right. Before we go back
depressing.
to Mike and the questions that he's going to curate and discuss from our participants, I want to go back, Gabe, to something you said before about the media's interaction with the police that I think should not be neglected. And of course, it's an issue in the United States, but it's really a huge issue in many countries around the world. Can you catch us up on that a bit?
Absolutely. Well, and it's directly related to the conversation that we were just having about how media is perceived in society. One thing that we saw in 2020 with all of the racial justice protests was a spate of incidents where journalists were, in a documented way, were clearly targeted by law enforcement who were executing dispersal orders, using less lethal munitions, or were arrested. In those cases, it's actually interesting. In the US, there's not that much law around what the First Amendment status is of a journalist who's covering a protest. And so in a lot of cases, the law enforcement would argue that, journalists don't receive special protections. And that's generally been the sort of the law, that journalists are treated the same as other folks. But one of the problems with that is that under the interpretation that was being put forward by law enforcement in many of those cases, the law enforcement could execute a dispersal order, which would shut down any independent coverage of how they enforced that dispersal order. So there's no independent narrative in terms of how law enforcement was policing those protests. And one thing that we've been trying to do at the Reporters Committee is articulate or clarify that the rule is you can't do that, right? That executing a dispersal order that shuts down any independent coverage of how you do that's unconstitutional. Now, the reason why I get into that detail is because the fact that law enforcement would be targeting, like turning a beanbag gun or something at a journalist who's clearly engaged in news gathering, that shouldn't be happening either, right? There should be a recognition, on both sides that there's a job to be done, and that people should be free to do that job. Now, I would say that maybe there's also reason for some optimism on that front as well. The Justice Department is engaged in several pattern or practice investigations into local police departments. In the Louisville case, they recently released their report, where for the first time in one of these reports, they've acknowledged the concern over law enforcement encounters with journalists. And we're hopeful that unfortunately it comes out of this spate of incidents over particularly 2020 and 2021. But we're hopeful that that spate of incidents may lead to some clarity in the law.
Thanks very much. I think this is a good time to go back to Mike Scott, and see what's come in the questions, and ask him to pick those up and continue our discussion.
Thanks for that. Some questions have been coming in, and I think first one, I think Jay might like to take this to start off on this one, because it comes from Mitch, and Mitch says, how are the challenges that journalists face today addressed in today's journalism studies? How can future journalists be better prepared for and protected from those challenges? You want to try that first, Jay, and then come to Liz?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and we struggle with it because there's a lot to get in. I think there is an increasing, there is a large and at least I think in the UK probably increasing focus on ethics. So a lot of the things we've been talking about here, how do you deal with particular situations that come up? What are the core principles of journalism and how do you meet them? So we do spend quite a bit of time talking about that, and the law as well. Dave's been going through a lot of really important legal developments, and we do train journalists on that as well. I mean, they're really important issues. I think, if I'm being honest, I think we probably don't directly confront some of these problems as much as we should. I think we do take a lot of time sort of getting journalists or getting students to a point where they can be good journalists, but a lot of that is kind of hands-on training. How do you interview someone? How do you cover a story? How do you operate the camera? How do you establish a social media presence? There's a lot to journalism now. And it takes up time and space in a curriculum. Here in the UK, we have our master's program is 1 year. It's essentially a boot camp. 1 year of 2 10-week terms, and then some hands-on work by the students. So we do struggle to get it in. It's an excellent question. We do try to, as much as we can, impress upon students these issues that are out there and the need for them to, be trustworthy, be transparent, get it right, be honest about who they are. We do try to do that largely through an emphasis on ethics, not just in separate ethics classes, but throughout the teaching that we do. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a really good question, because we do socialize students to a very great extent in what it means to be a journalist. So it's very important that they think about all these different things in thinking about what it means to be a journalist, not just sticking a microphone in front of someone's face and getting them to spill their story.
And if I could add one thing onto that, because as you say, there is a whole litany thing. One thing I'm going to make a pitch for as well is business. I think journalists, again, because we have wanted to focus, and traditionally, right, we have that wall, as we should, between editorial and business, but journalists need to understand the economics of business. They need to understand. We're seeing especially a lot of folks wanting to go off, start new ventures, or be part of things. People really need to understand what's under the hood, what needs to be under the hood, because I think that we've had generations of journalists who basically had no idea about it, and I don't think it has served us well.
Yeah, I just say it's an excellent point. We do have a class in which we talk about, you want to go out and start your own thing. How are you going to make this more than a hobby? How are you going to make this sustainable? How are you going to engage your audiences? How are you going to keep them? How are you going to grow them? So absolutely, really good point.
Mike, do you want to add anything to that?
I think I'm going to take a pass as someone who's never been to journalism school and has no and has no advanced degree besides my bachelor's. So, but I'm interested in what Jane and Sharon had to say.
Can I throw a curveball to you, Sandy, and just ask how many of the journalists, students at Georgetown get involved in freedom of speech project?
Oh, quite a few. Well, with our free speech project, I guess that gives me just a half a minute to promote what we're doing, to point out challenges to free speech around the United States, and actually to free expression broadly defined, and it's extraordinary. And Mike, as you know, I also have never attended any journalism school, but I ran one for quite a few years. Just the raw evidence of people, how quick people are to dismiss issues of free speech and free press is very depressing. We started this project 6 years ago with about 15 or 16 incidents that we were tracking, and we now have almost 800. And we simply cannot keep up with them all. And it's a little crisis we have right now, is do we have to become more selective and only report on really, really serious things, or try to find more students, more funding to make it possible to keep tracking everything, because the number grows. I mean, Donald Trump did wonders for the business of the Free Speech Project, of course, because by the examples he set. And I have to say that Boris Johnson helped out a little bit too. For the things that have happened are truly extraordinary. And I think one thing we've inevitably neglected here is how this goes on in small towns, unnoticed by very many people, in America and other places as well. That if it doesn't catch a headline, if it doesn't reach a certain level, and Gabe, I see you shaking your head. I mean, I'm sure there are many reporters who need the help of the Reporters Committee to figure out how to get through some of these crises.
No, definitely. And we also have a hotline, so pitch for our hotline if journalists ever need to speak to folks at the Reporters Committee.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, you go to our website, rcfp.org, and that's up there. But I think that's exactly right. I mean, if it doesn't generate a headline, if it doesn't generate some coverage, beyond the locality that these things can go, unchecked. And again, I mean, part of it is that we as a society need to, the law can only do so much. It has to be a social commitment, a general commitment to principles of free speech and and sort of basic conceptions of American liberty.
Mike, if I may, I gave you a cheeky response, and if I may just take a second chance at this, I do think the one thing that I think about at Freedom House is kind of the role of journalists in a democratic society, and I think helping prospective journalists, understand that critical role, understand the kind of virtues and the traits that they need to bring to their profession, fair, tolerance, fair play, consideration of all views, a search for the truth. I mean, I know that sounds a little bit high-minded, but I do believe, like from my observations, that some parts of the profession have gotten away from that, and I think that is something. I do believe that journalists are really important actors in a democracy, and that's a really important responsibility. And I think whether that's done in journalism school or whether it's done in other forms, I think is really important. Yeah,
I think that's a great response. There's an issue in the UK over the party scandals. Boris Johnson and having parties when he shouldn't have the parties during the lockdown and so on and so forth in number 10. But there was an issue there, was whether some journalists had got too close to government in order to get stories from government, and were at the parties, and it's that kind of moral dilemma, I'd have thought, that maybe it should come out in terms of some of the teaching. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that. Jane, do you want?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, journalists do get very close to their sources, and I think it's particularly an issue in the national press and the national media in the UK because they're all from the same social class. I mean, there's some recent figures I came across. Is something 80% of journalists in the UK, their parents were middle class and up, right? And those are the students who are coming to us at university. And we're very much trying to, address that problem and offer scholarships, bursaries, ways to broaden the stream, the funnel, the channel, whatever the right word is, of people going into journalism. But it's very much an issue that journalists and politicians, particularly though not exclusively in the UK, they're kind of in the same social circles, and that is it's a real issue and a real concern. So I guess it's a good point.
Is that a case in the States as well?
It certainly has been. I don't know if anybody wants to draw particular attention to it. But,
well, it certainly is in Washington, right? I mean, the Washington political class, we just had the White House Correspondents' Dinner, for example, which is always sort of a you see a lot of politicians and journalists side by side. I think, just to take us in a slightly different direction, because I think this actually it goes to the trust issue, but I think it also goes to the dearth of local news in the U.S. and many parts of the world. I mean, it's not just a U.S. issue at all. It's happening all over the place. We've got a partner in Brazil, for example, who's been tracking the deterioration or the growth, I should say, of news deserts in Brazil, for example. And so people don't see journalism at the local level. They don't know a local journalist. They don't have that experience. And so when they see, misbehavior, shall we say, at the very sort of elite top of journalism, that's what they think journalism is.
That's right.
And I think, so it makes those kinds of when those things happen, they get even more attention. They get even more amplified because there's nothing to sort of counteract the other impressions of what journalism is. So I think that's another in a very long line of reasons to that focusing on ensuring local journalism and having that connection to specific communities is so important.
I would add to that, Sharon, that there are vast news deserts in the United States.
Huge, absolutely.
Especially in rural areas, especially in some of the less populated states, where the fact is very few people know what's going on. And
there's all kinds of evidence and research that, voting declines when you don't have local news. You don't have the same levels of civic participation. So, to Mike's point, it really is very directly related to the health of our democracy. It's not abstract.
Thanks for that. There are three questions that are coming out very similar in one sense. Two are from Mazarine Claire Penzin. He's asking about, he's saying that it's easy now because of the new platforms for false information to circulate and users to question the reliability of journalism more generally. So how are journalists working to keep up with the sanctity of truth and good journalism in the wake of such easy access to information? Do you want to have a go at that, Gabe?
Not really, but I'll try. I mean, this is the most difficult question around because on the one hand, absolutely, it's a concern. I think it's Mark Twain that said a lie circulates, or is around the world before the truth even gets out the door or something like that. But it's also tricky because what's the answer? And if the answer is that the government steps in and tries to police what it perceives as misinformation or disinformation, then you may have an even bigger problem. And this goes to the point I was making about these longstanding legal precedents being challenged in the digital age, because in Texas and Florida, you have laws that pass that explicitly give the state government the ability to police what it perceives as bias on social media. So social media takes down something that it says is medical disinformation or doesn't comply with its policy on hate speech, for instance, and those state laws would permit the state government to force the platform to keep that speech up. Those laws have been, again, stayed in terms of enforcement because of the First Amendment concern with them. But it's a really tricky problem with how do you calibrate responses, and we've been having the conversation now for, well nigh on a decade, and it kind of comes down to, well, media literacy. But, and I realize that is, a deeply unsatisfying answer for many people. But at the end of the day, the what social media platforms, they reflect us, right? They reflect human foibles, human fallibility, and they can amplify problems that we have socially, but in terms of responding to them, it's not a new problem, if that makes sense. It looks new, but the way that we've tried to address it, legally, we've been having these debates, since well before the advent of modern telecommunications.
Mike, you look as if you want to come in on this.
I would just say this is a huge conundrum for journalism. I mean, really, what is journalism if nothing but the search for the truth? And now with the ease of, as Sharon was saying earlier, the ease of the spread of disinformation, that search for the truth is really challenging and really difficult. And I'm very empathetic of my friends in the Fourth Estate for what they have to deal with, just the kind of blizzard or the fog of disinformation and falsehoods that are out there, and sorting that out. But it doesn't mean we can't try. And I think what I wanted to say is, one thing that I worry about a little bit, from now being outside of journalism for more than 10 years, the daily practice of it is, I do see a lot of calls for, strong action to take down disinformation and to take down, certain types of speech. And, I think that I think we just need to kind of be very cautious about that. That there's certainly, there are real problems on the internet that need to be regulated. There's certainly, Twitter mobs, there's bots, there's, the specific things that, I think we should be on guard against. But we have to also be cautious about using the censorship or the repression of speech as the antidote to that. And so I think that is something I worry about, looking at this from a little bit from the outside now.
Claire, I'll come to you, Sharon. Claire continues in another question, and she says, is there a way for journalists to break into these spaces, these social media spaces, and build access consumption of reliable journalist outlets for their news?
Oh, journalists are doing that all the time. I mean, they've broken in, every Facebook pivoted to video, journalists pivoted to video. TikTok, everybody's got a TikTok, not everybody, but journalism is always looking to get in those spaces. So it's not that they're not there. The problem is a couple-fold. One is that news you consume on social media platforms is less trusted. So you have sort of, audiences do not trust news, even credible news, as much if they see it on a social media platform as if they saw it on that news organization's own website. So you can get into those spaces, but as Twitter mobs, et cetera, as Mike pointed out, they're not always favorable spaces, and they're algorithmically designed to to pump up, they push, it's the Pavlovian dog, right? Your emotions, are what drives the algorithm to a large extent. So I do think it's important to get into those spaces. And I do think journalists constantly are looking for ways to more effectively get into those spaces. But as I said, it's a big challenge to do that. And I think the other issue is that, to Mike's point about, the disinformation, that finding that balance and that line, right? And there's concern. Where I don't think there is enough, and which inhibits, I think, journalistic engagement with social media platforms in some countries, is non-English language. Non-English language, online harassment, threats, targeted disinformation campaigns, those really go under the radar for most of the platforms. They make, there's some attempts, we can argue about how good or bad those attempts are, but in non-English language, there's very, very little done. And going back to what I said earlier about sort of, targeted attacks against in particular women journalists and journalists from marginalized communities, these kinds of attacks, again, in non-English language, are very coordinated often. And we've done research that shows, women, for example, women journalists are getting pushed out of these spaces. They don't engage, they don't interact. And that is not good if we want to sort of use those as a way to reach audiences. So I think those are a couple of important trends to pay attention to as well.
Thanks for that.
Mike,
yes, Sandy.
if I may, I just want to add one thing quickly, which maybe I've waited too long to say this, but we have to be careful what we wish for sometimes on the policing of these things or the response to these things. I've been watching in the last week or so the absolute joy with which the ouster of Tucker Carlson from Fox News was greeted. And I'd be the last one to have any brief for Tucker Carlson. But should we be so happy that someone with such a vast audience in this country telling us what people are thinking, and much as we're horrified by it, can be so easily dismissed and gotten rid of? Who might be next in some other places? And they might not all be on the right. In fact, it's guaranteed they won't all be on the right. And there's a myopia sometimes. I don't think it's unique to the United States, but when some bad guys get shot down, people don't pause to say, wait a minute, what is the precedent that's being set? And who might be next? And what might someone that I or you or they are sympathetic with are also vulnerable in a way that really does a lot of harm.
Yeah. And I'm going to come to the last question, if you don't mind, Jane. It's from Dr. Joe Simmons, SJ at Georgetown. And he says, in the US and the UK, it seems like there is a new division in politics and journalism alike, not between left and right, but between established traditional media and outsiders' independent voices. Would you agree with that, Jane? You again?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think there are lots of different kind of ways you can divide things up, and there's certainly pushback. Yes, against some of the traditional voices. There's Sharon was alluding to kind of startups, and there's quite a few kind of really good local startups. There's quite a few good investigative journalism startups, and so there is some attempt to kind of say there's another way of doing things. Real quickly, in relation to the previous conversation, journalists are all over social media, largely because they want to use it to drive traffic, but that's another issue. I'll just say with generative AI, with the chat GPT and these other technologies, the misinformation is about to get a whole lot worse, exponentially worse. It's going to be really impossible to tell what's true, what's not, and who's behind it. On the plus side, though, and this is kind of to the point about are there new forces pushing journalism in different directions. I would just highlight the really quite significant rise in the past 5-6 years of fact checkers as kind of a dedicated. Some are within journalism organizations, but many are not. Kind of a dedicated force to the pursuit of truth, and to the point we were talking about earlier about transparency, very much dedicated to saying, this is why we're telling you that this is true, because here's all this other information that's behind it, and here, look, we're going to link to it and you can check it out for yourself. So I think there are lots of emerging media outlets of different kinds. Some are journalistic, some are are kind of outside of journalism, but that are really seeking to combat these problems we've been talking about today. So there is room for hope.
Good point, Jane. Alarmingly, in some states, there are legislators who want to make fact-checking either illegal or require fact-checkers to register with the state.
Well, yes, there are some legislators who would, of course, want to do that, but I think they're going to have some legal challenges.
We have to hope for sanity
get
to
there.
prevail.
You know, if I may just butt in on this fact checker thing, I think it's a great trend, but I also think what I find interesting about it, again, from the outside, is that the more and more fact checkers there are, the less people believe the fact checkers. I mean, the fact checkers going to the point that Mike made, you know, that this kind of divide between kind of the establishment and the new people. You know, if Glenn Kessler is good friend, he's a fantastic fact checker, but I would just guess that, you know, the fact checks are being fact checks by both sides, and people are not believing it. I think that goes to the question that you were saying, Sandy, earlier about the trust in media. I mean, the more and more good work it's being done, it's not really resonating with many people, and I think that's a big problem. I would also say that we haven't really talked about it a lot today, but your question, Mike, just reminds me about the economic underpinnings of fact-based journalism. It is still being eroded, and that is really, in some ways, the most existential threat to press freedom, that we have not yet figured out a business model to support free and independent press, and local news around the world, not just in America, is just, you know, a good case study of that. And now philanthropists are going into this. I think that's a good thing. There's the NPR model, but, you know, philanthropists may in 5 or 10 years move on to the new shiny thing. And then how are these newsrooms that are being set up going to be supported? We haven't yet figured out how to do that. And I think that's a real problem.
Well, but I would just say that there is also, and yes, a huge problem, and ultimately many of these problems are economic, absolutely. But there is a growing success model in getting audiences to pay for news they believe in. You know, The Guardian here in the UK has been a kind of in the leader of that, and what they find is that people say, when they subscribe to The Guardian, or, you know, become members, or just give them money, they want to support the journalism that they think is good. I mean, that's what I said before, where, you know, people support a free press, but then they see the what they perceive as the reality, what the press is doing, and say, no, I don't support that. But I think to kind of pull together a lot of the things we've been talking about, if you give them something that they can trust, and that they do, you know, acknowledge is doing a good job, there is support for it. Not the same amount of support they got from advertising, but some support.
There is, and I do think it's not a business model, it's multiple business models. And you do see, again, smaller organizations, it goes back to the question about, you know, larger traditional media and smaller. You know, I'm a big, that's where I do feel optimism and hope is a lot of small and medium ventures that are starting, that are fact-based, that do have direct ties to a community, have a clearer path towards people willing to pay for it. I mean, because there's a big gap. You have your Guardians and your New York Timeses and your Wall Street Journals, but then there's sort of everybody else. I mean, we've kind of in some ways lost the middle in a lot of ways, but you do have these small organizations. And to your point about fact checking, Mike, that's where also I think you're seeing more trust in that. There's an initiative we're supporting, for example, called Fact Checkiado, which is working in Spanish language media, about 44 different Spanish language communities, mostly in swing states, because Latinos are very targeted with disinformation in the US. They're more susceptible to it because they spend more time on social media than other American communities. And so, again, tying all of these things together, there is an opportunity to have you to be more optimistic about fact checking and that partisanship, depending on where it's coming from. So I'll be the optimist for.
With optimism shining in the window, we ought to. That's a good note to conclude on, Mike.
Yeah, I was going to say one last word from Mike and from Gabe. One last quick word, Mike. Anything?
You know,
Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm always optimistic. I believe that you know, journalism is like democracy, regenerative, and is going to, you know, figure out its own way. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to happen, and I'm really happy to hear the optimism from Sharon and Jane about fact checking and about you know, nonprofit, you know, journalism. I think that's exciting. You know, one thing, if I may say, journalists are under threat from, we've cataloged a lot of different things, but one thing I'm worried about is journalists being targeted who are working outside the borders of countries. And you know, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which commanded a lot of attention from free press groups, is not the only thing. And so I think, not to end on a depressing note, but I think that kind of transnational repression, that transnational violence from authoritarian regimes is something to watch for.
Okay, thank you. Gabe, one last.
I mean, I'll end on a note of optimism as well. I mean, you know, I'm a lawyer, and so I'm always focused on those issues. But I you know, I do think that despite the fact there has been despite the fact that certain conversations that I think we all thought had been litigated far in the past have been reopened, you know, in the past, let's say 4 or 5 years, I do think the general sense is towards that those conversations have been litigated and that we're closing those things up. I could be wrong, but if you take New York Times v. Sullivan, for instance, the case that puts First Amendment limits on state defamation claims by public figures, I just, you know, we surveyed every judge that was appointed by President Trump who called for opening up the libel laws during the 2016 campaign. We surveyed all of their decisions that cited that Sullivan case, and the only Trump-appointed judge who has called for potentially revisiting Sullivan is Justice Gorsuch, and then there's one other district court judge in Florida, but you really don't see the sort of groundswell of, you know, let's get rid of that 50-year-old precedent. So again, I'll end it on I guess a boring note of optimism with respect to
Okay, thanks very much. Over to you, Sandy, for one last word from you.
Well, just quickly, I want to thank everybody. We've gone over our usual time. We pride ourselves on trying to be disciplined, but this has been a great conversation. We're grateful to all of you for participating. We're very grateful to our ongoing support in the case of the Free Speech Project from the Knight Foundation, which has kept us alive, and we're about to do some regional free speech conferences. Look for us in a community near you in the next year or so, and to Georgetown University, which has supported this work and believes in it, and puts very few constraints on our search for the truth. No constraints at all, I should say, and we're grateful for that. Check us out, freespeechproject.georgetown.edu. Back to you, Mike.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks to Jane, Gabe, Sharon, and Mike. I knew it would be difficult to bring this to a close today because it's been such a great discussion from all of you. So thank you very much, and thanks, Sandy, again for chairing it. The next Free Speech Project of the Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future of Humanities Project will be on Monday, the 5th of June. And would you please note that it's on Monday? We're having to change the day that week. So it's Monday, the 5th of June. And we're going to be discussing democracy in the United Kingdom. Interesting in the week that we've got a coronation. Anyway, that's this week, but it's going to be the 5th of June, Monday, the 5th of June. I'd also like to mention that on Tuesday, the 9th of May, in the Benton Beautiful World Literature, Arts and the Environment series, Professor Mike Collins from Georgetown University will be talking about the myths relating to the land of America. Again, something not to be missed, to listen to Mike, one of the best teachers I think Georgetown recognizes as ever having. So Mike Collins will be there on the 9th of May. My thanks to people at Georgetown. My thanks also to people in Oxford, including Nick Austin, the master of Campion Hall, and to the people at Blackfriars Hall as well. both the regent and also the director of the Las Casas Institute. My thanks to John McCabe in the US for his work in administrating these events, to Laura Lee, as my UK publicist, to Maggie Scott, who also helps me so much in putting this side of the pond, the matters in proper order. Thank you all for attending today and for your support for our various series, especially, of course, to Sandy, the director of the Free Speech Project. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until the next time, take care, keep safe. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.